I'm Dr. Finley Catrone, Associate Professor in the William F. Harrah College of Hospitality at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Are you thinking about a career in hospitality and tourism leadership? We've created a series of introductory video lectures to help you explore career opportunities. If you're watching this video, you probably already know that global travel and tourism amounted to $11.1 trillion in 2024. The industry is expected to support approximately 348 million jobs globally this year. In the hospitality industry, we create great experiences for people, whether in hotels, restaurants, event planning, integrated resorts, or other tourism-related entities. When we think about careers in hospitality, though, most of us think of customer service roles in hotels and restaurants, which is true. But career opportunities are so much broader than that. What are you interested in? What is your ideal profession? Because we have careers in that. Hospitality is a business, of course, but it is also an art and a science. From hotel management and food and beverage leadership to meetings and events management and luxury experiences, hospitality is a dynamic field with opportunities worldwide, offering an endless list of managerial and leadership roles. Do you hope to become a director of finance or revenue, or maybe director of marketing, or a vice president of hotel operations? Maybe you're interested in casino operations or golf. Hospitality careers are varied and exciting. If you enjoy working with people, problem solving, and a fast-paced environment, hospitality could be the perfect career path for you. And there is no better place to study than the entertainment and tourism capital of the world. We have undergraduate and graduate programs both on campus and online. The Harrah College of Hospitality, the #1 hospitality program in the U.S. and top 3 in the world, is the ideal stepping stone to building your career.
Hi, I'm Alan Feldman. I'm delighted to be here to present an overview of responsible gambling. Gambling has been part of the human experience since the earliest days of civilization. We see it reflected in art, in music, in dance, in opera, and in movies, all in ways that vary in their depiction of gambling, but all show that gambling is very much a part of the human experience. One of the things that I would point out is that of late, probably the most impressive and significant image of gambling is that of James Bond. And over the last 50 years, we've seen any number of depictions of Bond as a suave and sophisticated person entering a casino, often dressed in a tuxedo, and gambling, and sometimes gambling very large amounts and taking some very risky bets. But nonetheless, it still is important to recall always that gambling has been with us for centuries. Now, there are a number of benefits to legal and regulated gambling, and we see these around the world. Casinos are very large employers. They're also very large taxpayers. For the integrated resort model, which is the most productive of all of the models of gambling, they then become some of the largest investors in communities around the world. It's a very clean energy. It isn't producing pollution and polluting rivers and streams and lakes. And lastly, the casino industry has shown itself globally to be very community-minded and very engaged in the community in helping out in areas where the overall community and the larger society can benefit. There is, however, another side to this that while it only affects a small group of people, it is nonetheless very serious. And that includes issues like personal debt and bankruptcy, divorce and job loss, unfortunately, domestic violence, and most unfortunately, suicide. And lots of studies have shown that suicide attempts, suicide ideation, thinking about it, and unfortunately, successfully committing suicide all happens at a much higher rate among gamblers, people with gambling disorder, than it does among even people with other forms of substance abuse, such as drugs or alcohol. So, what do we know about problem gambling? And how do we separate research from anecdote, from stories that we may hear? Well, until the mid-1990s, there really wasn't a lot of research, certainly not in the United States, and even around the world, there wasn't very much peer-reviewed, high-quality research that tried to look into what this phenomenon of gambling harm really meant. Now there has been a tremendous amount of research around the globe, and all of it tends to come to the same conclusions. Gambling is very common, but gambling disorder is not. The fact is that in prevalence work around the world, we see that people with gambling disorder tend to be around 1% to 2% of the population. Probably closer to 1% in most westernized countries, but still you'll see the range moving around a bit between 1% and 2%. There's another 4% to 6% of people who are experiencing harm of some kind. This can be mild, it can be one time, where you gamble one time more than you should have, and it may have an impact on you financially or emotionally or in a relationship, but it's one time, as opposed to something that is more chronic or even more severe. If you're looking at gambling harm and the number of people affected by it, it's probably going to be about 6% of the adult population. But what's really important is to remember that the remaining 94% of a population are gambling, not experiencing harm, and carrying on in their lives in a normal and orderly way. So the vast majority of people who gamble do not experience harm. However, those that do, it's quite serious. There's a continuum in problem gambling that's important to know, that gambling isn't static in society. It tends to evolve and change over time. As I mentioned, the majority of people gamble without any negative consequences. However, there's the continuum. There's movement on this, and you can move from left to right into areas that involve severe harms or even the less severe harms that we've spoken about. And the thing to really appreciate about this image is the fact that people will move closer to the right side. For some, the very first time they experience harm, or within the very first couple of them, they're going to back up and start moving the other way. They will learn to control themselves and control the gambling in a way that gets them back into a healthy range. That may even include no longer gambling. But for others, that harm continues to worsen and can at some point become a loss of control, which is what really defines a person with gambling disorder. Now, I said that the population, the number of people who may be affected, could be 6%. But it's also important to remember that it's not just the gambler. It's also the gambler's family and friends, coworkers, and neighbors, all of whom may be affected in some way. The family usually gets it the worst because they are the closest and they are the ones most likely to be impacted from any harm that's taking place. But we don't want to discount how this can affect others in the community. In many cases, gamblers will ask friends or neighbors or even coworkers for loans and financial help. It can ruin relationships. It can take away jobs. It can cause other bankruptcies. Can even cause crimes. In fact, if the gambler is someone who owns a business and bankrupts the business and now puts a whole number of families out of work, you can see that this begins to have an ongoing impact that goes well beyond just the gambler, him or herself. Through the years, there has been a lot of confusing language about this situation. We have referred to problem gambling, as I have earlier today. There's also compulsive gambling and at-risk gambling and pathological gambling, and worst of all, degenerate, which is an incredibly stigmatizing concept. My reason for showing you all of these is that we've really got to ask ourselves, what are we saying and what do we mean? What are we trying to mean? So if you're talking about someone who has a diagnosable condition, that's gambling disorder. If you're talking about other people who have what we often call subclinical problems or subclinical harm, generally speaking, you'll find that referred to as problem gambling. But those two groups of people have very different circumstances happening in their lives. And it's part of the reason why I think we need to be very careful about words that we use. Responsible gambling policy consists of three main premises. Number one, the ultimate decision to gamble or to not gamble belongs to the individual. That may sound as if we're saying it's the individual's fault and that all responsibility rests with the individual. That could not be further from the truth. The importance, however, is that you can't simply state that the reason for this is external to the individual. It has nothing to do with them, because it's going to make it very, very hard to get into and ultimately to recover. It's one of the fundamental precepts of treatment with gambling disorder is that the individual has to acknowledge that they themselves have done this. There may be any number of reasons why, but they have done this and they now need to engage in recovery. The second premise is that different stakeholders must work together. Sometimes they're stakeholders who may appear to be at odds with one another, but responsible gambling doesn't really work unless you have government, both elected officials and regulators, public health officials, academics and researchers, affected individuals. Gamblers themselves should be involved in these discussions, as should their families. And obviously, gambling operators need to be involved in creating policies and procedures that ultimately affect public health. Finally, responsible gambling programs and procedures should be guided by science. They should be guided by the notion that you don't do things until there's some evidence that they will work. In saying this, I'm not suggesting that you freeze and do nothing until science proves it right. However, there's a lot of science about a lot of different things that we already know has beneficial impact to communities. Guesswork really shouldn't have a seat at the table here. The typical regulatory model in most jurisdictions involves employee education, a self-limit program for guests, the ability to exclude oneself entirely from a gambling facility, public education, which is unbelievably important because there is such low understanding and awareness of this condition in the public, credit restrictions, which are often in place even without regulation simply because businesses tend to be very responsible when it comes to giving out credit, but nonetheless, there may need to be credit restrictions. It's critical that government give funding for treatment and research. As soon as you've agreed that there is some form of gambling that is worthy of being legalized, you should also understand there are people, even without legal gambling, who are already right now in need of treatment. And so having treatment and research funding is a very important part of the entire regulatory model or policy model. And lastly, properties should all have signage and information about responsible gambling, information about resources that folks can access in the community. This is all part of a very standard kind of regulatory model for responsible gambling. Employee education tends to come out into four distinct steps. The first is that all employees receive initial training on responsible gambling. And when I say all, I do mean all, every one of them. We can sometimes believe that it's only employees in the casino who are affected by this, but that's not true. You can actually end up where a guest says something to anyone at any level of an operation, and they should all have an understanding of how to be able to respond. Annual refresher training is also very important and is usually part of the standard package of training that happens. And then there are programs throughout the year to remind employees of policies and procedures, to do additional training for those who have greater levels of customer contact than others. And then finally, there's a small group, but obviously a very critical group of people who are trained to identify customer service concerns and to report those to management. I want to make certain that I'm being clear. They are not being trained to seek out and diagnose someone with a problem. They are looking for signs of any sort of stress, anxiety, anger that really relate to having a good customer service experience. That, in fact, may be something that is caused by experiencing harm from gambling, but sometimes it isn't. Either way, if someone isn't having a good time, if someone is expressing frustration or anger, it's probably a good time to intervene. And that way you're not intervening and accusing someone of having any sort of disorder, but rather making certain that they're having a good time and that they may need to take a break. And then you may get into a conversation further about exclusion or limits. Self-limit is fundamentally an idea that puts control completely on the individual and the ability to say, I don't want to receive any marketing or promotional materials. I don't want to have emails or phone calls from an operator. I should not be allowed to cash a check or to obtain credit. This creates an enormous amount of control on the part of the guest. For even greater control, casino may implement time limits or play limits in order to help guests control what they're doing, have a good time, but then not get too deeply engaged. Now, if you study these kinds of programs around the world, you'll see that the percentage of guests who use self-limit programs is relatively small. In fact, it's very small. However, the guests who do use self-limit report very, very high levels of satisfaction. For many of them, this was their first step on the road to recovery. And so it can be a very critical moment for an individual, and in the scheme of things, it is not incredibly costly or unmanageable. Self-exclusion takes this to a higher level. Self-exclusion involves a moment where a player says, I cannot be allowed onto the property. I can have no interaction with a gambling facility. And so it puts in place the framework by which a casino operator can exclude a person from even entering in the first place. Now, like self-limit, self-exclusion is also controversial, in part because, again, a very small number of people self-exclude. However, like self-limit, a very large number of those talk about how important it was in their recovering from whatever gambling problems they may have had. And again, they may have been short-term and, maybe only relatively severe, or they could have been incredibly severe and consequential in gambling disorder. One other important point to mention about self-exclusion is the fact that casino operators have the ability to place someone onto the self-exclusion list involuntarily, even though they themselves may not have asked. If the casino feels that it's the right move for that individual, they can place them on the list. It's also important to remember that casino employees tend to have a higher prevalence of gambling harm than the general population. This has an impact on business. This has an impact on absenteeism and potential for crimes, for financial distress, and even financial distress for coworkers who may be asked for money. It can lead to hostile work environments, and obviously it can also lead to fraud or theft. So part of the idea of having responsible gambling programs in place also is about turning it internally and addressing your employees' needs. There is a lot of new language that's beginning to come out about responsible gambling. There's even some discussion in some circles that the term responsible gambling should be done away with. I'm not of that opinion, but I do appreciate the fact that for some, responsible gambling has certain connotations that some believe are stigmatizing. Where we see a lot of dialogue right now are in areas of player health and well-being, player protection or player safety, safer gambling, and most importantly, harm minimization. Now, all of these are in use in various countries and in various languages, and I don't know that we're ever going to end up globally landing on a single concept in discussing this. I actually think we're going to end up, in some regards, talking about all of it. And if you look at this construct, it should look like the overall way in which we talk about activities that involve risk. We do talk about health and well-being and protection and safety. When we're talking about things like mountain biking or water skiing or snow skiing, and any number of other activities that we enjoy, but they also carry risk. So I think where we're going with language in general is probably into a greater discussion about the risk that you're taking when you do gamble and understanding that there are risks. So now I'd like to share a commercial that speaks to responsible gambling in a way that doesn't necessarily suggest that anyone has a so-called problem. It just speaks to general behavior, a talk between two friends. For those who may not be aware, this is a commercial that ran principally in Canada, and the gentleman on the left is a very, very famous Canadian hockey star from the National Hockey League. So let's watch this and see how two friends can have a conversation on this topic without anyone accusing anyone of doing something wrong.
Dude, did you know BetMGM has responsible gambling tools so you don't get carried away?
I never get carried away. Well, there were the bobbleheads. And the playoff beer.
Chili's ready!
Well, those tools could really help.
Don't forget about the backyard rink.
Yeah, these tools are pretty great.
BetMGM is committed to making gambling safe and fun with responsible gambling tools, so you don't get carried away.
So they talk about gambling being safe and fun, and they talk about prevention, about harm prevention, by talking about it as getting carried away. And let's be honest, which of us has not gotten carried away with something in our lives? We want to be certain that we're understanding that gambling is one of those areas where getting carried away can actually lead to problems. So, the future of responsible gambling, well, first and foremost, as we have just seen in that commercial, we're talking about elements that address the majority of customers, not only those who are experiencing harm in real time. It is talking about taking measures to focus on players' health and well-being and to provide necessary tools or techniques to keep gambling fun and affordable. From a policy point of view, it's very important that we support player protection. We're not going to be able to identify every single person who is in the throes of gambling disorder, but we can put in place protections that allow players to take action on their own or to have action taken on behalf of the operator in order to see to it that they are, in fact, protected. So another way of looking at this is that it's all about prevention. That's really what's critical. I'm not suggesting that we ignore anyone who is in the throes of gambling disorder. It's very serious, and it does often require, certainly would benefit from, medical intervention. But for the rest of the population, and certainly the vast majority of people who gamble, we're trying to see to it that they have a good time, that they enjoy it, and that they come back, and that we always do our best to prevent any problems from happening in the first place. Thank you.